Welcome in here to Live Now from Fox. You're taking a live look there at Capitol Hill this morning as the government shutdown now entering day two. The federal government thrown into a shutdown yesterday with no easy endgame in sight as Democrats held firm to their demands to salvage health care subsidies that President Trump and Republicans in Congress have dismissed as something to possibly discuss later. The White House also threatening mass layoffs of federal workers rather than the normal furloughs in a matter of days. Blame being cast on all sides here. But how does this shutdown compare to others we have seen in history? What's different this time? We're going to bring in Rubino, political analyst and friend of the show. Thank you so much for joining us bright and early here on Live Now from Fox this morning.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, Rich. Well, can you speak to the historical context of government shutdowns? How many have we seen in history? How do they typically play out?
Well, there have been 21 in history, and the modern budgeting process actually goes back to an act that Richard Nixon signed his last month in office before he was forced to resign, and it basically created the modern way that budgets are done. That you have to have the budget in by a certain time. For example, so the first one was actually under Gerald Ford in 1976, and it lasted about 11 days. Eventually, there was an agreement. There were a bunch in between there. There was one under Carter, under Reagan, that didn't get a lot of coverage. But then you had one under President Bill Clinton in 1995, and Bill Clinton had been elected in 1992 on an agenda of change. He had basically in 1994, the Republican Party actually picked up the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years, and many believed that Bill Clinton was going to land up losing re-election. Some even thought that maybe he shouldn't run again, or there should be a major primary challenge that year. But what happened was there was a government shutdown between Bill Clinton. Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House at the time. Senator Robert Dole of Kansas was the Senate Majority Leader, and Bill Clinton won the public relations war and ended up winning re-election in 1996. So that was very much, I think, in bad stead for the Republicans. And then in 2018, there was the longest government shutdown in American history, and that was between Donald Trump and the Democrats over the border wall, and that lasted longer than any other one in American political history. And some believe that helped to contribute to the Democrats taking over the Congress in the 2018 midterm elections. So generally speaking, this really is a public relations war between the Democrats and between the Republicans, but we've seen 21 since the contemporaneous budget process has been effectuated.
Well, so then, Rich, that leads to this bigger question here and really the focus of this interview. How does this current government shutdown compare to the ones that we have seen those past 21 times?
There's actually a lot of similarities, because usually there's something that is kind of the sticking point. For example, back in 1995, Bill Clinton liked to talk about how he used to say that the Republicans were trying to cut Medicare, that they were trying to cut funding for the environment. The Republicans came back at the time and said, we're just trying to truncate the growth of the programs. But the American people at the time saw the growth as terms of being benefits, and that's why it definitely benefited the Democratic Party at the time. Now, this time around, I think the Democrats think from a public relations vantage point that talking about extending subsidies from the Affordable Care Act is something that's going to be politically advantageous and politically is going to help them, because the Obamacare Act, even though it was very unpopular when it was passed and signed by President Obama in 2010, it is very popular today. And I think the Democrats believe that potentially a lot of the constituents of some of the Republican members are going to have a lot of animosity toward Republicans for not extending that. Now, from the Republican standpoint, what they're saying is, look, we're going to give you a clean congressional resolution, a clean CR, if you will. And then after this passes, then we can negotiate this. So they're not basically saying that we are completely opposed to the idea of extending the subsidies. They're simply saying we need to get the government going. And I think from a political standpoint, I think that they believe that that's going to benefit them, because they're going to say we're the ones that really want the government to continue. They're the ones that have a special interest, and they're the ones that are holding it up. So that's where this kind of political tete-a-tete, I think, really is in the present state.
And you had mentioned those sticking points, and that was what I was going to ask you about, because we know healthcare is the big one here. Now, Rich, we asked viewers yesterday to write in their questions, and we got this question quite frequently. How long is this going to last? And I guess the answer is we really don't know, right? But if we look at history, how long do these shutdowns typically go on for, and how do they come to an end?
Usually it's about 10 or 11 days. I think that the two major ones that went quite long were the one between Bill Clinton, Bob Dole, and Newt Gingrich back in 1995, and then again in 1996, and Donald Trump in 2018. But for the Republicans, basically, I know even though the Republicans hold a 53 to 47 majority in the United States Senate, that includes Angus King of Maine and Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who are independents but who caucus with the Democrats. You need 60 votes really in the United States Senate because of the filibuster, because of the cloture rules. So right now, the Democrats. The Democratic Party, you have John Fetterman, you have Senator Mastro from Nevada, and you have Angus King, who caucus with the Democrats, who are voting with the Republicans right now. So basically, the Republicans, all they don't need a majority of the Democrats to vote. There are a lot of Democrats that are not going to get the votes. What they need is three Democrats to come over the line to vote with them, and I think that that's basically what they need. That's what they need. They don't need, as I say, they do not need a preponderant majority of the United States Senate, of the Democratic caucus, rather.
When we talk about just the effects of a government shutdown, whether that be economic or when it comes to the political landscape, what effect do you think this is going to have on that? And what have we seen previously when it comes to that?
It's very interesting. Generally speaking, at least in the Democrat one in 1995 with Bill Clinton really really got the political traction that he did not have in his first 2 years. He was relatively unpopular in his first 2 years. His job approval rating went down to the mid 40s. And then people really started to see him as a tribune of certain government benefits like Medicare, like Medicaid, like environmental protection. And this helped him win a re-election bid in 1992 when he won 49% with three major candidates, 1996 rather, with three major candidates, and he almost won a landslide in 1996. This really effectuated that. This really helped to support Bill Clinton in 2018 with Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump saw this as a way to really increase support with his base, because the border wall was one of the kind of flagship issues of his presidential campaign. He wanted the $5.7 billion funding for it. But it really, I think, took a turn for the worse for Donald Trump. And in 2018, the Democrats landed up winning the House of Representatives, and his arch nemesis Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House. So I think that those are the two examples. It doesn't mean that Democrats are necessarily going to benefit this time, because Republicans are saying again, we just want a clean resolution to pass, and then we will go on and work on other things. But in those two examples, it was the Democrats, I think, that generally benefited from a purely cold, calculated political vantage point.
And Rich, you've touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you, when we talk about the most effective strategies for resolving these impasses, what really needs to happen here? What can we expect as we do continue to watch here in the coming days or maybe even weeks?
I think the Republicans are going to try to do everything in their power to get three Democrats to land up voting for the continuing resolution, and then they get this over with, and then they will negotiate with the Democrats to try to in some form extend the Obamacare subsidies. I think you got to look at who the potential three Democrats are going to be. They've got three already. They got three already. I think John Fetterman was probably the most expected one, because he's been probably the biggest maverick in the Democratic Party. But you've got to look to other Democrats that they want to. And I think that, for example, someone like Mark Warner and Tim Kaine represent states like Virginia, relatively center-left moderate Democrats. And I think that in the case of both of them, they don't seem to have presidential ambitions, and they represent states with a lot of government employees. So those would be the ones that they would probably look at. I think that any sort of a Democrat who potentially either represents a liberal state or has presidential aspirations is probably in their political best interest to oppose the clean resolution. I think we saw last time around. If you look at the Democrats that kept the government open last time around, you had Chuck Schumer, and when Chuck Schumer voted that way, it really created a lot of tension in the Democratic Party. Even Hakeem Jeffries would barely mention his name. I think many in the Democratic Party said we need somebody else as a leader. There's talk already in 2028, should he seek re-election in New York, that potentially AOC would run against him. The other Democrats, though, who voted to continue to keep the government open were other members of leadership, Dick Durbin, who's not seeking re-election. Gary Peters, senator from Michigan, who is not seeking reelection. And then you had those like Angus King, who's basically very independent minded, may not seek reelection, but he was just reelected, but he's currently 81 years old. So you got to look at the Democrats in terms of Democrats who aren't seeking presidential aspirations and potentially maybe retiring are the ones the Republicans really have to look at trying to cultivate.
My last question for you, Rich, is when we look at previous government shutdowns, have any of them led to any significant legislative or policy changes in the past?
Not really. Usually you go back to kind of homeostasis. You make some sort of a minor deal at the time. So it's more political, and a lot of this is really public relations. And I think members of both sides know that. They also know that it is more likely than not that there is going to be a resolution to this. So I think a lot of this is just kind of a public relations, almost a charade, if you will, on the part of both sides.
All right, Rich Rubino, thank you so much for joining us, as always, here on Live Now from Fox. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.